The Splendid and the Vile by Erik Larson. Prime Minister Winston Churchill's first year of leadership was marked by continuous air raids, death, and destruction. But he met these challenges with resilience and grim resolve. He refused to back down to the Nazis and focused his efforts on enlisting the American aid and support that would help the British win the war. Despite sustaining high civilian death tolls and mass homelessness, the UK held against the Nazis until Churchill was able to secure Roosevelt's support. A third-ranking Nazi official, Rudolf Hess, tried to arrange a secret peace deal with Britain, but by the time he delivered his message, Churchill had no interest in pursuing peace. In June of 1941, Hitler diverted his attention to the east, launching an attack on Russian Bolsheviks, which distracted him from his efforts in England and ended the threat of a Nazi invasion of the UK. In December of 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States fully into the war and securing Churchill's confidence that the Allies would emerge victoriously. Churchill needed to enlist American help. By May of 1940, the Nazis had invaded France, and Winston Churchill, the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, knew that Britain would soon be forced to enter the war to defend their ally. Churchill had only recently been appointed Prime Minister after the Parliament's vote of no confidence in his predecessor, Neville Chamberlain, who had tried to appease Hitler and failed. The Nazis possessed formidable military force, and most people doubted that the UK had any chance of defeating them. However, Churchill had confidence in Britain's ability to win the war, but he also knew that American involvement would be necessary in order to ensure victory. Convincing the U.S. to help Britain was Churchill's main goal. However, in order to convince the U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt to enter the war in support of the UK, he had to convince them that Britain had a good chance of defeating the Nazis. The U.S. government did not want to get involved in the war, especially so soon after they had come back from World War I. They were also mistrustful of Churchill. They feared he would be an unreliable ally, and some were skeptical of his drinking habits. Churchill was an eccentric man who had unusual working habits. He liked to bathe twice a day and would retrieve phone calls naked from his private secretary if he received one while in the bath. He kept odd hours and would wander the halls in flowery dressing gowns. Despite Churchill's eccentricities, the British people put their trust in him, and he took his job very seriously. He was realistic about the grim predicament the country was in, but demonstrated a firm resolve and provided some measure of hope to his countrymen. He focused all his energy on preventing a Nazi invasion of England and committed all his efforts to ensure Britain would win the war. The Dunkirk rescue boosted British morale. The Nazis were already embroiled in the battle with France, whose powerful military and impenetrable Maginot Line helped the country put up a good fight. However, after less than a week of fighting, the Nazis broke the line and advanced into France. Allied troops retreated, and within 6 weeks, France had been defeated. Now that the Nazis had conquered France, they were ready to set their sights on Britain. However, hundreds of thousands of British Expeditionary Force troops still remained stranded in France. They retreated to Dunkirk, a town on the coast of France, with Nazi soldiers close behind. They had little hope for rescue, but on May 24th, Hitler made a mistake. Serious initial losses caused Hitler to halt his tanks, which enabled Churchill to order an immediate evacuation of the British troops across the Channel. On May 26th, the Dunkirk rescue began, but his expectations remained low. Churchill believed that only about 1 in 6 of his troops would make it home. On the first day, only 7,700 British troops had been rescued. However, by the second day, civilians arrived in private boats to aid the rescue. In total, 887 rescue vessels arrived in Dunkirk, only 1/4 of which were Navy vessels, and over 300,000 soldiers were rescued. Churchill was able to use this victory to boost British morale and generate support for the British war effort. He was committed to going to war with the Nazis, and shortly after, Hitler began his campaign of aerial assaults on Britain. The Luftwaffe and the Royal Air Force. The Germans' air force, the Luftwaffe, was the most powerful air force in the world. It had 4 times as many fighter planes as Britain and more sophisticated planes and bombs, which meant the Nazis had the capacity to force Britain to surrender with just their air assaults alone. The Luftwaffe possessed a terrifying plane called the Stuka plane, which was giant and could carry explosives, understandably nicknamed Satan bombs, that weighed 4,000 pounds and could destroy a city block in seconds. But what made Germany even more dangerous was their advanced radio beam technology, which enabled their bombers to locate their targets even when visibility was limited. Britain lacked this technology, and so their air defenses were greatly hindered in foggy conditions, nighttime, bad weather, and poor visibility. Churchill assumed Germany's main bombing target would be London. He knew that without equally powerful aerial force, Britain would not be able to defend itself. Therefore, on his first day in office, Churchill created the Ministry of Aircraft Production and appointed his friend, Lord Beaverbrook, as the minister. Beaverbrook immediately went to work, and British factories began churning out fighter planes at an unprecedented rate. This shocked German intelligence, who did not anticipate their exceptional success. However, Germany was continuing to bomb the British countryside, and intelligence reports showed that a London invasion was close on the horizon. However, Britain's Royal Air Force was proving to be a daunting match for the Luftwaffe, and aerial battles between the two were even broadcast on the radio for the public's entertainment. For his part, Hitler was delaying the invasion of London because he was still hoping he could strike a peace deal with Britain, which would save him a good deal of time, money, and effort. Hitler was certain Britain would lose the war, but Churchill didn't think so. Churchill gets President Roosevelt on board. Despite Britain's success at aerial combat, the country still needed U.S. help, particularly in the form of naval support. Churchill wrote a note imploring Roosevelt to come to their aid, saying that it was not simply the fate of France or Britain that was at stake, but also the entirety of Europe was at risk of falling under Nazi rule. He requested destroyer ships from Roosevelt, but he had to carefully frame his request in a way that ensured Roosevelt understood the life-or-death importance of the ships, without making him write off Britain's fight as a lost cause. Initially, Roosevelt was mistrustful of Churchill and simply replied to his request with a good luck wish. However, Churchill did not give up on Roosevelt and continued to send him daily telegrams. Despite the Royal Air Force's best efforts, the Luftwaffe still had better technology and more firepower. More importantly, the German pilots were more experienced than the British were. Despite their significant disadvantages, the British fighter aces knew they were fighting for the survival of their homes, and that losing meant their country would be invaded and life as they knew it would be over. They also had radar technology, which helped them keep pace with the Germans. Soon, Hitler became furious that his Luftwaffe was losing more planes than the British, so he decided to change tactics. He organized the launch of Operation Sea Lion, a full assault by the sea on Britain, which would take place in August of 1940. But before the invasion could begin, Hitler wanted to morally and physically reduce the Royal Air Force. However, the delay bought Churchill time, and he finally succeeded in securing Roosevelt's help. Roosevelt had managed to find a way to work around neutrality laws and still provide the British with destroyer ships, albeit old and rusty ones. The Secretary of the Navy devised the Lend-Lease Plan, in which the U.S. would offer to lend Britain the destroyers in exchange for U.S. access to their naval bases located in the Atlantic. Churchill had managed to sway Roosevelt, but the U.S. president still had to get the plan passed through Congress. Operation Aldertag. Hermann Göring was the commander of the Luftwaffe. He was receiving contradictory intelligence reports regarding the state of the Royal Air Force. Germany's intelligence lead, Beppo Schmidt, told Göring that the British forces were faltering and badly damaged, but his pilots in combat were reporting a much stronger Royal Air Force. Based on the strength of Schmidt's intelligence, Hitler decided to launch a major aerial strike called Operation Aldertag, or Eagle Day. However, that decision proved to be a mistake almost immediately. The operation was called off on the first day due to bad weather, but some Luftwaffe planes made it through anyway. Those planes were met with an aggressive Royal Air Force defense, who learned that they could exploit the Stuka plane's weakness. The British had learned that the Stuka planes were vulnerable when they dived, and they put this knowledge to use, shooting down twice as many planes as the Germans did. Operation Aldertag was a massive failure. Churchill was pleased with the Luftwaffe's failure, but at first he couldn't understand why the Germans were launching a raid instead of simply bombing London. However, soon Churchill realized that Germany's plan was to cripple the Royal Air Force, which would enable them to launch a full-scale bombing attack on the city without their interference. The British people were fearful of the impending attack, and the fear was exacerbated by Nazi propaganda spread by propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. The Nazis still planned to launch Operation Sea Lion, although they had delayed its start until September. However, plans were forced to change again when a navigational error caused German bombers to get lost and accidentally drop their bombs over London rather than their intended target on August 24th. The very first attack on London had begun, and Churchill finally had an excuse to launch his own offensive attack on Germany. Just one night later, Churchill sent his Royal Air Force fighters to launch an aerial attack on Berlin. Bombs over London. In response to the Royal Air Force attacks on Berlin, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to attack London with full force. Göring devised a plan called the Destruction of London as punishment for Britain's continued humiliation of the Luftwaffe, and many other Nazis, like Goebbels, were excited to begin the assault. However, not every Nazi was on board with the aggressive attacks on Britain because they saw the British as their racial allies and did not want to go to war with them. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former first deputy, began trying to arrange a back-channel peace deal with the British. However, he was unsuccessful, and the bombers began flying out to London. The Germans organized 3 bombing waves. In the first wave, almost 1,000 planes dropped a combination of high-explosive standard bombs, incendiary oil bombs, and time-delayed bombs on the city over the course of one entire night. By the morning, 500 Londoners had been killed, and 1,600 were injured. The very next day, Churchill toured the wreckage, but was buoyed to see Londoners remain resilient, planting Union Jacks in the rubble and insisting they give it back in kind to the Germans. The second and third waves of the German attacks continued over the next 2 consecutive nights. The bombs and air raid sirens were constant, and nobody could sleep. One bombing attack even targeted Buckingham Palace, and although the King and Queen suffered a near miss, the Queen appreciated that she could now empathize with the hard-hit Londoners. As the Germans rained bombs on London, the Royal Air Force returned the attacks in kind. On the Battle of Britain Day, September 24th, the British shot down 183 German fighters in just one day, while losing less than 40 of their own. In response, Hitler and Göring only redoubled their efforts. Operation Barbarossa distracted Hitler from invading England. As autumn came around, Hitler once again postponed Operation Sea Lion, deciding the Royal Air Force was still too powerful to begin an invasion. Instead, he turned his attention to defeating Russian Bolshevism. Despite the risks of running a two-front war, Hitler decided to begin Operation Barbarossa in the east, believing it would be easier than trying to invade Britain. In the meantime, Göring continued his bombing campaign across British cities. In November, the industrial town of Coventry suffered severe damage, with 500 people killed and over 2,200 buildings destroyed when the Luftwaffe dropped 500 tons of explosive and 20,000 incendiary devices on the city. The constant attacks also led to a financial crisis in Britain. Many British people were suffering, having lost their homes due to the bombs, and were forced to live in cramped shelters in abysmal conditions. For their part, the Germans considered Churchill's failure to surrender akin to a war crime. While Hitler kept his focus on Operation Barbarossa, Rudolf Hess continued to pursue his secret peace plan. After the Coventry bombing, he decided to try a different tactic. He planned to fly his own plane into Scotland, where he could deliver his message of peace in person. Roosevelt decides to act. Churchill decided to reach out again to try to secure American support, this time in the form of food and military materials. Roosevelt, who was on vacation in the Caribbean, did not respond right away, but when he returned, he decided to help the British. During his Christmas-time fireside chat, he publicly committed his support to the British cause and used the word Nazi for the first time. In retaliation for Roosevelt's speech, the Luftwaffe dropped an aggressive number of bombs on London's financial district, sparking the Second Great Fire of London. By the time the new year came around, the Germans had killed over 13,000 London citizens. Churchill was undoubtedly devastated by the destruction, but he knew that the bombing had helped win Roosevelt's sympathy. Harry Hopkins, a close friend of Roosevelt's, came to London to assess the situation, and he and Churchill quickly took to each other. Churchill took Hopkins on a tour of London, and his presence helped boost British morale, indicating to the British citizens that the U.S. cared about their plight. The visit made quite an impression on Hopkins, and when he returned to the U.S., he impressed upon Roosevelt Britain's desperate need for help and urged Roosevelt to provide assistance. However, Hitler was furious with Churchill's continued resistance. He wanted to force him into surrender, so he ordered Göring to launch a full-scale attack that would completely finish off the Royal Air Force and fully clear the way for an invasion. American support rises, but the bombs continue to fall. On March 11, 1941, Churchill learned that Roosevelt's Lend-Lease plan had finally been passed in Congress. Soon, the British would receive access to American destroyers. Even more importantly, the passage of the plan was an important symbol of American support. Churchill celebrated this news by playing military marches and executing rifle drills. However, the celebrations proved to be fleeting. The air raids continued and only grew worse as the Americans became more involved. Churchill began to worry that the Londoners wouldn't be able to take much more. He was also receiving bad news on the ground front as well. In North Africa and the Middle East, British troops were losing to Nazi forces. They also faced significant problems in the Balkans, where Bulgaria had joined the Axis powers. Churchill began to rely increasingly on the Americans as bombs continued to fall over London. In April, Parliament called for a debate over the war, and Churchill retaliated by calling for a referendum on his whole government. However, during the referendum, Churchill swayed the votes to his side with an impassioned speech, and the vote passed. Shortly after, however, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to attack London on May 10th, using every available aircraft in their arsenal. Beginning at 11 p.m., over 500 bombers dropped thousands of bombs on London for 6 continuous hours, marking the worst raid of the entire war. By the time it was over, Westminster Hall and the British Museum were on fire, Big Ben had been bombed, over 1,400 people had been killed, and 12,000 people had lost their homes to the bombs. Hesse's last-ditch attempt at a peace deal goes down in a field. However, while the Luftwaffe swarmed London, Rudolf Hess still had not abandoned his plan to broker a peace deal. After 4 attempts to fly to Scotland, Hess finally made it across the border, but became lost and was running low on fuel. He made an emergency landing in a farmer's field where he waited patiently until the police arrived to arrest him. While in a Scottish prison, Hess met with an officer named Major Donald. Hess told the surprised Donald that he had a secret message for the Duke of Hamilton, a Scottish lord who he believed would be open to brokering a peace agreement. Donald was able to arrange a meeting between the Duke and Hess, but by this point, Britain had no interest in brokering a peace deal. Instead, Hess was locked up in the Tower of London. Hess had also delivered a letter to Hitler explaining what he was planning to do. When Hitler received the letter, he was furious and sent Hess's close associates, including his assistants and even his astrologer, to concentration camps. The news soon captivated the public, and it had even caught Roosevelt's attention, who believed the story would be good for the war effort. To boost morale, Churchill encouraged newspapers to run stories about the strange Hess affair. Operation Barbarossa changes the course of the war. From the start of the London bombing on September 7, 1940, to the most destructive air raid on May 10, 1941, almost 29,000 Londoners had been killed and 28,000 had been seriously injured. Across the UK, over 44,000 people had been killed, 5,000 of them children. In just May of 1941 alone, over 5,600 British people had been killed by German air raids. However, on May 11th, the air raids began to slow down. Hitler now realized that Churchill would not surrender. By December, the UK's air raid death toll had dropped down to only 37 per month. Instead, Hitler focused his energy on launching Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941, opening up a second front in the war. He believed this operation would only last 3 weeks, but was taken by surprise at the strength of the Soviet army. Operation Barbarossa distracted Hitler and prevented the Germans from launching an invasion of England. Churchill received more good news for Britain in December of 1941, when he heard the news that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. He immediately decided to declare war on Japan right after President Roosevelt did the same. He now knew that with the U.S. firmly on the side of the Allies, the war had swung in their favor. Churchill now had the honor of leading his country through a great war. The main takeaway. Churchill's steady leadership and resolve helped enable the UK to stand strong against the Nazis, despite untold levels of destruction and suffering caused by continuous, aggressive air raids. Churchill was committed to enlisting American aid for the war, and his resilience paid off when Roosevelt committed his support at the end of 1940. In the summer of 1941, Hitler decided to open a two-front war by launching Operation Barbarossa in the east, which ended the threat of a Nazi invasion of England. After the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the U.S. officially joined the war, and Churchill believed the Allies' ultimate victory over the Nazis was secured.
Hi, I'm Rhonda, and this is an exclusive audiobook video recorded for the Audiobook Master channel. Enjoy your audiobook and have fun learning. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification button so you'll get updated on our next upload. If you liked the video, give us a thumbs up and say your thoughts about the book we just covered. Do you want to listen to a summary or review of a book that we haven't covered in the past? Say it in the comments below or send us a message. Don't forget to check our other uploads. Enjoy listening.